Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session on spiritual abuse during this month, which is Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. And we're now in our third session. Our final session will be next week as we talk about what individuals and what institutions can do to preclude this kind of thing happening or what to do if it is happening. But today we're very honored to have several guests. One is Alan, and Alan is coming out of a situation that was very much an abusive situation on staff at a church. And I'm going to limit it to that because Alan's going to tell his story. And then the other person I want to introduce is a friend, has been a real mentor to me in my spiritual direction experience at Southern Methodist University, and that's Lee Gerald. And Lee was my supervisor in my spiritual direction program and just a phenomenal mentor, guide, wisdom, just showed me a lot of things in the practice of spiritual direction, but also really helped a lot of things concerning myself. And so it's an honor to have Lee on. And Lee is not incognito today. He's said that he'd be happy to be able to share his name and face. And so, what we've asked all of our panel to do, that Nathan and Beth Davis, Grant Jones, Lee, and myself, we have put our email addresses in the chat box. So, if you want to get in contact with any one of us, don't hesitate to do that. And Lee, again, has offered to have anybody that may be participating in this to also connect with him. And I would certainly encourage you to do that. A wonderful brother. And so today we are going to jump into this because this is a unique session that we're having where we are talking about, we're talking with, I should say, people that have experienced spiritual abuse, and also then one that was also a spiritual abuser. And that one, now is really hard for me to imagine this knowing Lee, but Lee is a reformed or recovering, as he says, spiritual abuser. And so Lee is going to tell his story, and we're going to listen. And I would encourage you, if you have questions, please write them into the chat box, and we will address your questions as we're going along. So the question is fitting the narrative that's taking place. So with that, Lee, we turn over to you, and thank you again for being here today. It's great to have you.
Yes, thank you, Mark and panel, and for all of those that are investing their time into this important subject. It's unfortunately, it's really helpful and necessary now to address this. I just want you to know up front that in my story, I've been spiritually abused. I've caused spiritual abuse, and I'm continuing to heal from both with the help of people like Grant, really good psychotherapist, spiritual directors, and one of my favorite groups, which is Alcoholics Anonymous. So alcohol, when I experienced spiritual abuse, alcohol was my drug of choice in order to cope and manage it. And of course, I kept that hidden because when you're in a spiritually abusive environment, you keep most things hidden. So, but between AA and psychotherapy and spiritual direction, I have received a great deal of healing. And I'm still in the process. And I must say that I've probably spoken more about my story of being spiritually abused than I have about being a spiritual abuser. So if I'm hesitant, just be patient with me. It's a kind of awkward, to be honest. But the reality is that people ask me, well, how were you a spiritual abuser? How did you do this? What did you do? What did it mean? And I just want to say up front that I did not recognize myself as having caused spiritual abuse in other people until after I started receiving healing from my own experiences of spiritual abuse. All right. I can also say that what I did was pretty much take the playbook that I'd been taught and trained with in my spiritually abusive situation. And I just passed it on to my congregation. I became a Christian in college through a non-denominational Christian student group who hosted a dorm Bible study. And I was enamored. I was involved. I was, a great fan. And I quickly wanted to pursue full-time ministry, both for God and within this same association of churches and student organizations that we had. So I was ordained when I was 25, and I got in touch with the experiences that were indeed spiritually abusive only by the time I was around 38 to 40. So I spent 15 years of ordained ministry being mostly unaware of the abuse that I was causing. Okay, and I'm not at all proud of that. In fact, it's deeply humiliating and embarrassing. But I will say that I essentially, when I became a pastor, I just taught and trained people according to the playbook I'd received. And a couple of things that demonstrate the obvious spiritual abuse is I was intolerant. I'll say it nicely. I was mostly intolerant of people who had the audacity to ask questions or give other viewpoints or, have well-meaning conversations. That's just the way it was. I came from a church that was an independent, non-denominational church. And so when I became a pastor, I was pastoring an independent, non-denominational church. The reason that's important is there was no accountability. You're self-governing. And so what I did is I set up a board in my church that I answered to that was filled with people that were loyal to me. Well, I came from a church that did the same thing. In fact, I was one of the loyal people on the board.
Who is this?
He's one of the guys that's talking. These are people giving explanations of spiritual abuse. Let's see here.
Oh,
Microphone.
We need everybody to mute, please.
So in my healing from spiritual abuse, I've been able to see a couple of things. One is spirit, and this, by the way, has been covered well in the two previous webinars that have been hosted here. Grant and Nathan and Beth and Mark have done a really good job of explaining spiritual abuse, offering resources. But usually spiritual abuse is coming from a person in a position of spiritual authority, right? And it's a misuse of their power. There's also a real misrepresentation of information. Now, that misrepresentation of information comes out in a lot of ways. And it certainly did for me because I'll just say it this way. The main ingredients that I look at that I realized are things that now they seem obvious. At the time, these were not obvious. You could say they lived in my subconscious maybe, or my unconscious, but I wasn't consciously aware of them or certainly able to admit them. But things like being deceptive in what I taught, or being manipulative, or using shame and guilt and fear, being intolerant, definite narcissistic qualities. Grant did a nice job of describing narcissism in the previous webinar, if you're interested in that. Another word that I like to use now is enormous amounts of unfreedom. lots of unfreedom. I mean, there just was not an encouragement given to the people in the congregation to go and freely listen to God, study, learn, allow the Holy Spirit to speak, to teach you, to create within you reality. That was absent. And in a very embarrassing way, I have to admit that in our particular church that I was trained in, it was very convenient because we were what I call anti-charismatic. Now, many of you are in the Assembly of God, and so you're definitely pro-charismatic. So I was not your friend then. In fact, I might have been your hated enemy because I was quite articulate and passionate and well-studied in the apologetics of arguing against why the freedom of the charismatic expressions and experiences were necessary today. Well, that one of the reasons why that's incredibly convenient as I look back on it is if you're not teaching people to be free with the Holy Spirit, it just makes it easy to teach them what you want them to know and tell them that's enough.
Hmm.
Ouch. One of the hardest things about this to admit and even to face is many times the spiritually abusive leader, when they're acting out their abuse, they're really not aware. I mean, they really, oftentimes, it's certainly in my story, the people that I received abuse from would not have been able to say that their intentions were abusive or their intention was to cause trauma. They would say my intentions are good and they could defend them and they would justify them very cleverly. And in fact, if you walked in wanting to question or doubt, you would walk out feeling bad about yourself, worse about yourself. Because, well, I mean, let's face it, most of these kind of leaders are incredibly charismatic. They're usually very passionate. They're articulate. And they're convincing, maybe a good word as well. So one of the things that was pointed out in a previous webinar is the environment to where congregations today want to have heroes, and so they put their spiritual leaders in that category, naturally creates the environment that allows for spiritual abuse to run rampant. I'm not saying that many of our leaders are not heroic at all, but I would say that what's happening is the leaders are being named as heroic, but what about the laity? What about the congregation? What about the average person who's following what they believe God wants them to be doing? Are they not equally acting heroically as following the Spirit in their circumstances in life? But anyway, congregations, certainly the one that I was in at that time, here's a couple of other signs that are, characteristics. The leaders are very charismatic and endearing. There was a real closed-mindedness about different interpretations of Scripture. In fact, there was really just one Bible version or translation that was used. It was not King James, by the way, but there was just one. Okay. And there were reasons why. And so it was really discouraged that you might use other translations. You did not feel the freedom or invitation to question the leaders or their beliefs. That was minimized. It was discouraged. Needless to say, there was kind of an atmosphere of elitism. We're kind of special. And we're certainly right about our beliefs. We're right, and that means by definition, everybody else isn't right. The answers that were given were very black and white, or either or right or wrong. There was rarely a both and. It was an incredibly dualistic approach to life and theology and God. If you didn't believe like we believed, we were happy to judge you, gossip about you, slander about you behind doors. You know, whatever it took for us to feel better about ourselves, that's pretty much what we gave ourselves permission to do. In our particular congregation, sexuality was taught as bad, it was dirty, it was sinful, it was to be avoided. Dating was discouraged. So what was prevalent? A lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of manipulation. Those were common motivators for change, although those words, of course, were never used. People are smarter than that. Okay, I was smarter than that. And, you know, it just wasn't reality. Tithing was taught as necessary in order to please God. There was only certain kinds of music allowed. You needed to have a daily devotional or quiet time because you had to appease a God who was angry, following you, being a policeman, or ready to judge you, condemn you, or create all kinds of havoc in your life. If something negative did happen in your life, well, it was probably your fault. You weren't being spiritual enough, you weren't being faithful enough, you know, etc. Mental health issues like anxiety or depression, oh my gosh, they were looked down upon. I mean, that's a clear sign and symptom of just not being spiritual enough. And so there were regular teachings and messages about, well, you don't have enough faith. Or the other way of saying that is you need more faith. And you didn't feel, usually the way I say it is when you leave, you feel worse about yourself than when you arrive. And to think I did ministry that way for years absolutely has brought me to tears many, many times. A common explanation for real problems in our lives or even in the world was, well, it's just God's wrath or God's judgment. And then incredibly simplistic answers to very complicated issues. And if you wanted to question, usually people that wanted to ask questions about the leader or about their doctrines or beliefs, certainly those were deflected is probably the word I would say. The issue or the question was a deflection. And let me tell you who was doing the deflection: the loyal followers of the leader, because that's who I surrounded myself with, who helped defend me against the people who had the audacity to ask questions or to doubt. Not naming the fact that I never gave them the freedom or the invitation to doubt or to ask questions, of course, but, you know, I didn't understand that at the time. Now, I was in an association of churches, but every church in that association was fully governing and independent of on its own. And so the association of churches was used for resourcing, if that makes sense. So, in a nutshell, my becoming aware that I had been in an environment that was highly legalistic and, highly legalistic, came because my life began to unravel. Now, I wasn't free to talk about it in the church because, frankly, if you had a lot of spirituality, your life didn't come unravel. There was just not a freedom to, you know, be real, so to speak. But I was real, and the way I was real is my marriage began to fail. So I went to see a therapist and trying to save my marriage. And what happened is she helped me save me. And I began to see, oh my gosh, look at the fruit of the environment from which I came. And the fruit was a lot of self-judgment, self-loathing, self-hatred, and not being real kind to other people, including my wife or my 4 children. So from therapy, I started seeing a spiritual director. At the time, I'd never heard of a spiritual director. I had no clue what one was. But and I want you to laugh with me at this, with the great humor of the God of grace, my spiritual director was an Episcopal priest who led the charismatic renewal in Dallas. So let's all laugh about that. Okay. So I started getting direction from a man who was not only anti-charismatic, he was able to assist me to see through the illusions and the delusions of everything that I'd believed, and help me to see how traumatic these events had been on me. And I do like to use the word trauma now in relation to spiritual abuse. I find that in our year 2024, there's a lot greater and broader and wider understanding of trauma. And some of the healing that I've done and the training that I continue to do is that trauma, any experience of trauma, whether it's a big T kind of trauma, which spiritual abuse is a big T trauma, or a little t trauma, which is like, Starbucks didn't get my order right on my coffee today. I mean, whatever it is, big T traumas affect what some psychologists call now our agency. And our agency is made up of our voice and our choice. And what trauma does is it takes away those. It takes away our voice and our choice. And it happens usually so subtly that we don't even realize it's happening at the time. And yet the healing of trauma, whether it's spiritual abuse or other kind of trauma, needs to include giving agency back to the person who's been abused. And this is what my therapist did. This is what that first spiritual director started doing. And this is what I've continued to find. I find people that offer me the freedom now to live into what I like to call my truest self, although it's taken me 25 years to even understand what that might mean. But the reality is that there was a lot of other complicated psychological or emotional issues, which even predisposed me to being okay with being in a church like that in the first place. I mean, why would anybody in their right mind choose a church like I chose or a church like I pastored? And I would just say, well, you're right. Maybe we're not all in our right mind.
Lee, let's pause a moment and see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. I have written down several from what you shared in your narrative today, but I'd like to put it out for everyone else. Is there anyone who would like to ask Lee a question over what he's just shared about perspective from one who is formerly a spiritual abuser? You can unmute yourself and ask the question if you like.
Lee, this is
I'd like-
Alan. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Lee, this is Alan speaking. I'm sure we'll interact a little bit more later as well. But I'm just so encouraged by your bravery to label some of your past action as abuse. That takes an incredible amount of courage and humility. And I'm personally struck by the it in my experience, it's rare for someone in a position like you were in as an abuser to undergo that. I would say transition, but maybe awakening is even a better word. Um, how how did you how did you process that awakening or that transformation? Because I've seen so many people stuck in a pattern of abusing others who don't get out of it and are never awakened and just continue to hurt and hurt and hurt. Was there a specific breaking point for you? Was there something that the Episcopal priest spiritual director said that really helped you, helped open your eyes?
Well, thank you, Alan, for the awareness and question. So again, I mentioned earlier that I'm an alcoholic, that I attend AA. And if you're at all familiar with 12-step recovery, whether regardless of the substance of choice that you're addicted to, in the world of 12-step recovery, we would say that no one gets to get better until they've hit bottom. And if you go and you haven't hit bottom, that's fine. You just won't get better. You can attend, but you're not going to get any better. But once you've hit bottom and you attend, then you might be willing to be open enough and vulnerable enough. And the reason is a 4-letter word, and that word is pain. P-A-I-N. So a famous Baptist preacher said, "No one changes when they see the light. They only change when they feel the heat." So when the heat got bad enough for me, my life imploded when I was 40. And the pain of that implosion, which included my wife divorcing me, losing the relationship with all 4 of my children, leaving the church. Thank God I left that church, and I resigned. And by the way, I didn't go back to church for 3 years. I wanted nothing to do with God or the church. So in a nutshell, God used AA to save me. And frankly, I don't think God really cares what God uses to save us. You know, I think you and I have a great defensiveness toward God, that God gets the credit. I just think that's our human problem. I don't really think God cares that much who gets the credit. So I'm telling you, I got saved in AA. And there's a reason I didn't go back to church for 3 years. I needed to hang around some place where people would not judge me, would accept me for where I was that day. Didn't make me feel worse about myself when I was leaving than when I arrived. They fed me as many donuts and coffee as I could handle. It was a beautiful journey. I would love to tell you that happened in a church. But it didn't. And it wasn't true in my church either. That atmosphere was not created in the church that I pastored. So when I imploded, lost my marriage, lost my ministry, lost my money, my children wanted nothing to do with me, lost my reputation, everything was gone. Basically, I was a combination of homicidal and suicidal. And so by the mercy of God, I found AA, I continue to go to therapy, and I continue to get spiritual direction. So that trio of grace and mercy is the environment that allowed my awakening to happen. And all of that to me is the kindness of God and the synchronicity of the Holy Spirit bringing the right people at the right time in the right way into my life just screams about how special I am to God. I never understood how special I was to God until after I had gone through an awakening. So another way that this is communicated today that I like is that there's no resurrection without a crucifixion. And so I went through my own crucifixion in my own story. And that allowed for a renewal, an awakening, a resurrection to begin occurring. I hope that is helpful.
Lee, that is helpful. We do have a question that came in, and it's Vanessa's right. Would you say that cutting ties with a spiritual abuser is the most effective way to love them?
I would say that cutting ties from the spiritual abuser is the most effective way to love myself. And it took me a long time to learn how to love myself because nobody had taught me how to do it. So I had to go to AA and therapy and spiritual direction to learn how to love myself. When I finally learned how to love myself, then I had the capacity within myself to start loving and forgiving and accepting the people who had abused me. And then that also allowed for me to experience the brilliance of the 12-step recovery program. You see, in step 8 and 9 of the 12-step recovery program, you make a list of all the people you've harmed. And you became willing to make amends to them. Well, you know what? I had a pretty long list of people that I had harmed emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually as a pastor. That's step 8. Step 9 is you then begin making amends to them.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your vulnerability there as well. It's not easy to admit when one has to hit rock bottom or when one has hit rock bottom, but it does take humility to say that. Grant, I think you said maybe this would be a good time for me to dovetail off of that. Yeah, so once again, Lee, thank you so much for sharing what you have. I want to share a little of my experience of spiritual abuse, and hopefully we can then continue to unpack as a group some of the implications that there might be for all of us. Thank you again, facilitators, for the opportunity to share and for even just the valuing of me as a person, protecting anonymity. So I just briefly want to share some of my experience of experiencing spiritual abuse, being the victim of spiritual abuse, and I'll share the overarching story, and also a few specific examples to help others grapple with. I know there's at least one comment in the chat about how it can be vague sometimes, and that is one of the most difficult things about this type of abuse. It's not always clear cut, or at least not always clear cut to both parties, as Lee sort of alluded to a little bit. So I experienced spiritual abuse in a church setting, like Mark said, as a staff pastor. I was a staff pastor at a Pentecostal evangelical church for almost 7 years. And at the end of my tenure, I ended up being fired after I finally confronted one of my spiritual abusers regarding some of the unhealthy patterns that I had seen for a number of years. So the church I was at was moderately sized and not a large staff, but the staff members were tasked with many different things. My portfolio in particular was quite large. I had what could be referred to as the gopher portfolio role, where anything that no one else on the staff could do, I was assigned. And my senior pastor, Sam, was very type A, get her done personality, and he had a drive to achieve. And sometimes I felt that his drive to achieve pushed me into situations where I felt he was asking me to abuse or at the very least mistreat some of our volunteers that I was overseeing in order to fulfill his goals. He obviously may not have felt that way, but I felt very uncomfortable at points leading in the way that he was asking me to lead. So my portfolio, I oversaw youth, young adults, everything tech, outreach, buildings and grounds, all the volunteer teams for those areas, and was also heavily involved in multiple aspects of Sunday morning services, including sometimes leading worship and emceeing, etc. So it was, for me, as someone who endeavors to work hard and manage time well, it was still an overwhelming task list. And early on, right after I began there, as often happens in transition, the youth group dipped in attendance slightly, and I was doing my best to get it back to what it had been before I transitioned in, while juggling an incredible portfolio. And I remember Sam brought me into his office once and confronted me and said, "What's the deal with the youth group? Why are the numbers still low?" And I said, "Pastor Sam, I'm doing everything I can." And Sam said, "Alan, I can't keep defending you to the board." And I just felt I felt helpless, and in my mind I was thinking, "Pastor Sam, I can't just make people appear out of thin air. I'm kind of doing everything I can." Just felt like an emphasis on numbers, and it was painful several years later once I finally vocalized that particular instance with a board member who was a board member at the time. The board member rolled his eyes and looked at me and said, "Alan, we never even talked about that in board meetings." So my portfolio was unmanageable, and it was difficult for me to enjoy my pastoral role. I tried to bring that up with Sam in gentle and palatable ways. And I said, "Sam, this is just too much. Can we redistribute a little bit?" And he often, I would use the word, I felt, appeased me by saying, yeah, we'll do that. But then nothing ever changed. So I reached a breaking point just from a workload perspective, staying up late answering volunteer emails and everything. And I said to myself, maybe I can show Sam what I'm speaking about. And so I scheduled a meeting with Sam, and I had written out my to-do list for the day, which was very long and comprehensive, and for me, impossible. And I scheduled a meeting with him and went into his office and said, "Sam, will you please just look at this to-do list with me? I want to try to help you see what I'm saying when I say this is just too much. I can't accomplish everything." And he took my to-do list in his hand. He glanced at the title and nothing more, and he tossed it aside and said, "Alan, I get it. We're all busy right now." And I once again felt quite helpless. So in conjunction with an incredible workload, I felt very, I mean, for for lack of a better word, and it's my feeling, so I guess it's pretty subjective. I felt somewhat oppressed, and that I could never get away from the tasks. Sam would occasionally call me on my off day. We as a staff had one full off day a week. And I occasionally he would call me to follow up on unfinished tasks. And I tried to confront him about that, trying to keep some good boundaries. And he did not like that. And once I was going on vacation, and partly because of that feeling like I could never get away, I requested Sam that I could digitally disconnect during my vacation and not be available by phone. I just wanted to have some holy solitude and not be receiving texts from youth group members at the wee hours of the morning, those types of things. And he balked at that, and he was unwilling to say that I could be totally unavailable by phone on my vacation. And I had premeditated a response, and I very respectfully said to him, Sam, I really, if you're requesting that I be available on vacation, I really think you're overstepping your bounds as a boss. And his immediate response was he quite demeaningly told me that I was being belligerent. That was my feeling. I did not feel valued or cared for. So, and you know, I do want to be clear. Number one, I'm sure I didn't do everything right in trying to confront him. I let human anger come through at points, and I'm sure misspoke. And Sam was not and is not an entirely bad person. He does care. He does want to help people, and he has helped me in ways at points. But my consistent experience was he helped me at points, but when I vocalized need, if it didn't align with his agenda, he did not address that need. That's just my experience. So to wrap up this story, at least, those feelings were fomenting for a while, and they simmered for about 6 years until the end of my tenure, when things came to a head pretty quickly and incredibly painfully. My wife, Allie, became pregnant with her first child, and we were excited but also concerned because we lived in a region of the country where the cost of living was considerably higher than the national average, and her job, her full-time job, was bringing in more of our household income than mine was. And so if she were going to become either a part or full-time mom, then we would lose her income. We would be in trouble to be able to afford housing in this part of the country. So I initiated a conversation with Sam about a potential raise, and things seemed to go well at first, and Sam said the board would make the decision. But right before I gave Sam some of the data and our budget and things that I was wrestling with in order to pass on to the board as he had requested. When I brought that to him, he started to renege on proposing my raise to the board. And I had given him papers with our budget and everything, and without even looking at them, he tossed them aside and in a bit of a huff said, Alan, you're going to be fine. You don't need a raise. You just need to trust God. And that was the breaking point. That was the breaking point. And I will insert that throughout this conversation and this process, he would even say things like, Alan, after everything I've done for you, you know, you're not making enough. And at one point he said, I just can't imagine that anyone would ever come to me and ask for more money and less work. And granted, that's a potentially valid sentiment, but absolute gaslighting, in my opinion. So I couldn't endure it anymore, and I paused in that conversation. I said, Sam, I need to shift away from this raised discussion, and I think I need to say something to you that will be very hard. And I very carefully and lovingly said, Sam, I I I don't mean to hurt you, but I think sometimes you exhibit some abusive tendencies. I went home and told my wife that I'd said that, and she probably wisely advised me, Alan, you might not want to use that exact word, as that could be a bit inflammatory in certain situations. So from there on out, I shifted to using words like bullying and domineering behavior. And I tried to lovingly confront him, and I can't say what was going on in his mind, but all I can say is the data of the facts of what happened. After the board meeting that night, the next day, Sam came in to me and said, Alan, people lost a lot of respect for you at last night's board meeting, and words like insubordinate were circling the room. And I was mortified. I was thinking, Sam, I felt I was trying to be very respectful. And I realized in my perception that I was being framed, that he didn't like how I had called him out, and he presented me to the board as insubordinate. And furthermore, because it had happened around a discussion of salary, he perhaps truly perceived it this way, but nonetheless re-articulated it to the board as if my confrontation of him was about money. And so he used words as precise and diagnostic and hurtful as extortion. He used the word extortion about me, again, perhaps perceiving that it was about money that I got upset. And the thing that I think hurts the most is, as soon as this was all coming to light, and he told me the perception of the board, I was immediately mortified, and I said, please, I think we had some misunderstandings. I don't think you're hearing me. May I clarify? I requested multiple times with him, can we have a reconciling conversation, maybe with a third party? I don't think we're understanding each other. And I said, may I speak to the board? I don't think I was represented fairly. And long story short is the board voted to fire me, and I was never once allowed a single audience with them. They said that I'd been disrespectful to Sam, and it just so happened, but it is part of the story, that right around that time, my wife lost the baby, and 5 days after that, the board told me that I was fired, and they requested that I not attend church events until I had quote unquote reconciliation with the board and Sam, which is what I've been seeking ardently. And no one had responded to my requests. I sent an email to the board saying, what are the next steps to reconciliation? And no one ever replied in 4 months. So because of the timing of that, after my wife lost the baby and we were essentially excommunicated, no one on church leadership even messaged my wife about losing the baby, even though she'd been a congregant for 10 years and a consistent volunteer. And the church leadership had sent out a letter about my termination. So congregants, as is expected in situations like these, felt confused about whether or not they should interact with us. So almost none of them reached out either. And then the church had a meeting where the leadership discussed my sudden termination, a meeting which my wife and I were obviously not allowed to attend, and congregants reached out to me afterwards and told me what the leadership shared at the meeting, and it was incredibly hurtful to hear words like extortion be used about my intentions. And one congregant said that the impression the board gave to the church was that I had become unhinged, and I suppose unhinged is what people who feel threatened call loving confrontation. That's just not in my notes. That's just an emotional aside. And so I've truly never been more hurt by a group of people in all my life. And my wife would say the same. And sadly, and this is what we're still reckoning with, that includes non-Christians as well. So Christian or not, this has been the most painful thing that we have experienced. So that's my story. Yeah, I'm excited to Lee, for you and I and others all together to unpack what do we do with hard things like this.
Jonathan, a question came in that said, and I think you've made it clear, but to answer the question specifically, did your feelings of helplessness leave you feeling diminished?
Absolutely. So yeah, I think words that come to mind, it felt very deflating. The helplessness, I think, frankly, I think probably had some physical effects. I think there were minor symptoms of depression that became stronger. As you can imagine, not much motivation to actually walk into work the next day. That became very difficult. I will say, just in my experience, since it's a new experience for me, specifically the experience of false accusation and the defamation of character. If someone, as many of us here do, care about how others perceive our integrity, because integrity is important to us, to have that integrity attacked in ways that cannot by us be rectified, is one of the most difficult and painful things I've ever experienced. So very diminished, yes.
You know, what you said reminded me of something that Lee brought up, Alan, and that is about how a leader may circle the wagons of people he knows he's going to get a certain kind of response from, and then it becomes a dog pile without any
Yes.
kind of conversation with you, no exit interview,
Right.
anything like that.
Right.
Just you were right and they were wrong. So let's move on.
Right. Correct. Yeah.
Any other questions for Alan at this time? You can unmute and you can ask the question, or you can write it in the chat box. If not, we'll move on to Lee to share his experience of abuse as well. You've heard about the side of an abuser, but now abused. Okay, Lee, let's go ahead and move on to you from your experience then, the flip side.
So let me give you a story that it exemplifies the atmosphere of abuse for me. And I just want to say, Alan, how very sorry I am that that happened to you. And I will gladly hold you in my heart for your continued healing.
Thank you.
I also want to say, like, it's so easy for me to say this, I am Sam. And I've worked for Sam. And it just means that the answers that we seek are not simple. They're complicated. Healing is a journey. I wish I could give you a pill, but the trauma that you've experienced has changed the way your brain operates. And that's why trauma healers that specialize in trauma healing specialize in understanding how the brain processes information. And the worst thing about spiritual abuse, from my perspective, is because I've received it, is we lose our moorings. We lose our sense of identity. We lose our sense of even being able to know for sure that we can hear God or sense God or connect with God. And so, you know, I said I didn't go back to church for 3 years. And many of the people that I see in spiritual direction that are recovering from spiritual abuse don't either. And they're looking for somebody to give them the freedom to find the agency, to find their voice, to find their choice again. And this needs to be offered in good psychotherapists and spiritual directors. There's just a lot of good people out there to help now because the awareness is much greater. But here's my specific story. When I was pastoring, and in particular, when I began to see the therapist trying to save my marriage, I began to be able to recognize, again, all by the mercy of God, my own parts in the demise of my marriage. In other words, it wasn't all her fault. And that's how I went to therapy. Let me tell you all the reasons why my wife is wrong. So the therapist, being quite a brilliant human being, began to expose the areas within myself that maybe weren't as truthful or as helpful as I wish they would have been. But I began to realize that I was part of the problem. And that invitation into healing just exploded. And it's a combination of self-awareness along with the love and forgiveness and mercy of God. Okay, so I, in my mind, think I'm becoming a better person. I meet this priest who's an Episcopal priest in spiritual direction, and he begins to offer me more healing. And all of a sudden, I'm really beginning to like the person I'm becoming. At the same time, I'm losing my entire spiritual foundation and philosophy of ministry for a church pastor. The way I had done it, it's all dissolving. So I go into the Association of Churches, and those that I considered mentors for myself, those that have spiritual authority that even ordained me and had spoken into my life for years. I was telling them about what I was learning about myself, and essentially the question is, how did they respond? And the answer is abusively. They didn't like my newfound self-awareness or self-understanding. They didn't like me embracing doctrine and dogmas and philosophy of ministries different from what they still represented. They knew I was struggling with alcohol abuse. They did not offer for me to go to rehab. They knew my marriage was crumbling. They did not offer for me to go to marriage therapy. And so, to be honest, they just took me out back and shot me. And whatever that feels like, if you were in my case, that's how I felt. I felt abandoned. I felt abused. I felt utterly unworthy. I felt like a rag, a dirty, old, useless rag to them. They no longer had a use for, and so they threw me away. I was ostracized in the association. I was gossiped about, slandered about, put down. They closed the church, sold the assets, and did not do anything to minister to the congregation that was devastated and had many, many unanswered questions. And only to complicate that, my wife, who I told you divorced me, she didn't like the person I was becoming either, because that's not the person she married. She liked the old Lee. So the spiritual authorities in my life liked the old Lee. Nobody wanted to embrace the new Lee, but people at AA. So that's my story. It's a simple story. It's not my only story.
Thank you, Lee, for sharing that. And let's take a look at a few comments and questions that have come in. One, it is asked by Beth to everyone, how do we see our blind spots? And then I'm going to dovetail that with Derek's comment to that. Derek then wrote, in light of that, I think we have to allow or ask for someone to expose our blind spots. By definition, we can't see them. So with those in mind, how do we see our blind spots, and how does that dovetail into seeing them, but then helping others define what those blind spots may be? And this would be to Alan and to Lee. And I would welcome, Grant and Nathan and Beth to chime in as well. Or for anybody else that's on has an insight into that. Maybe if you found some help from a source, a person, and to reveal blind spots.
One thought that has come to mind. So I think this experience has caused me to think quite a lot about my future as a pastor and how I will want to do things differently. And I can't shake the feeling that for all of us, for anyone, including me right now, I think we have to facilitate space and tools to invite critique and disagreement with us. If we create an atmosphere where no one can question what we say or perhaps challenge a decision, it seems to me that inevitably will lead to a situation where we will no longer see our blind spots because no one will feel validated or comfortable to even vocalize dissent. And I think in certain Christian theologies, that is really difficult because we want to appear like we have it all together, right? Kind of as Lee was saying, and we have to figure out a way to sort of reconcile our desire for Christian sanctification and holiness with an acceptance that we're not fully there yet, and it's okay if others help us get there.
So, Alan, I loved what you said, and I just want to second that. It really is okay for others to help us get there. In listening to the webinars from the last two sessions, Nathan made a comment in the last webinar that I really appreciated. And he said, if we're honest, it's very human to realize that we too have abused people. It's just a function of our brokenness. It's a function of our woundedness, of our having grown up in dysfunction, so to speak. But it's really human. But the willingness to listen to voices outside of our own does take a bit of courage. And I would love to tell you that I got it because I wanted it and because I saw the light, or I felt invited by Spirit to do it. I'm not saying Spirit didn't invite me. I'm just saying I didn't listen. What motivated me to listen was my marriage was crumbling and I didn't want to lose it. So I was willing to listen to a therapist who offered me insights into me. And I also listened to my spiritual director. And frankly, I listened to my fellow drunks that I found at AA. They're very wise human beings. They're not there to impress people. I can assure you nobody goes to AA because they want to go. And they're very wise. And I learned a great deal about myself listening to them. But again, notice that by default, I'm saying I had mirrors. I had other people mirroring back to me what was going on. And the catalyst of that was hitting bottom, pain. And I don't wish that on anybody, but I just think it's part of our human condition.
Lee and Alan, a question that's come in, particularly to Lee, but I'm going to include Alan in this as well. Did leadership use your weaknesses against you, or quote weaknesses? I mean, Lee used the term weaknesses, but Alan, if there's something you want to pick up on that.
I would love to hear Alan's response to that question.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Lee. I would say yes. And I think what I mean by that, perhaps ironically, but I would say maybe providentially, connects a little bit with what Lee said when he was essentially discarded and taken out back and shot. In my case, while I was trying to manage everything well and my opinion right now is nobody really knows how to best confront someone in authority over them. That's a really tricky thing. I just reached a breaking point and said, well, I have to try my very best. But when it was, and please hear me, I'm not trying to be anything but humble, but boy, I tried my best. And when it was anything, when it was just the slightest bit imperfect, oh, you raised your voice a little bit too much. My whole argument was dismissed, right? So my human anger was essentially seen as a weakness and essentially used to invalidate the content of what I was saying. Well, no one who's thinking clearly would actually, become upset like that. And it was, it was. So the paradox was, unless I had figured out a way to confront my leader perfectly, I could not confront him at all. Yet no one can do it perfectly. And that was very difficult.
I would offer one other insight that my spiritual director and therapist both offered as an awareness. And that is that the spiritual abuser, in the midst of their abusing, is what they call highly defended. They're unable to hear anything that would not be interpreted in their mind as being supportive of who they are and what they're doing. They're heavily defended, and they may defend by blaming you. They might defend by blaming someone else. But what they're not doing is they're not trying to accept responsibility for any part that might be their own. And that's a very, I think the grant described that as being narcissistic. And I would agree. I think that's a dimension of narcissism. And now I can see the narcissism that was prevalent in the leaders that abused me. I can see the narcissism that was present in me as an abuser. And I still have to continue to be humble enough to process when the narcissism and the implications of that continue to raise their ugliness in my own life to this day. God's not finished with me, and if hurt people, then healed people can heal people. And at best, I'm just a wounded healer, and I'm still healing. That's about as good as it gets for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask Lee a question. Lee has a spiritual direction session at 11:30, so we'll have to wrap his part of it up by that time. But I want to ask you a question I wrote down earlier. You said, quote, "I was taught by the playbook I received." And when I came out of seminary, I went on staff at a large church and did college and career age, did pastoral counseling. And it was not a very good experience. It was one of those where I learned what not to do as a leader more so than what I learned to do as a leader from the lead pastor. But with that thought in mind, with the playbook we're giving, for me, I could have absorbed what he did as a leader and said, okay, this is the way to do it. But with the conscience within me and the way I was treated, I rejected that completely. But what does this say to the training that we're giving to people in leadership, whether they be pastors or they be mission leaders or they be parachurch leaders, wherever people may be in leadership in a spiritual way, in ministry and missions in the marketplace? What does it say to the need in the area of training on how not to do this? Where are the guardrails? So Lee, I'm posing that to you.
Thank you. I feel a little inadequate to address that with any. I think I'm still processing my own experiences, and I'm still making amends to people that I've harmed. To be honest, I'm haven't delved into the realm of institutions of higher learning and training, certainly like you're familiar with and have led and done, Mark. So I feel pretty inadequate to know how to answer that.
I appreciate that. Let me ask just one more, squeeze this in from me. And another question I wrote down, when did you realize that you were a spiritual abuser? And I go to the point to what Nathan said, because of our fallenness, there's none of us cannot say, for the grace of God, there go I. And this has really caused me to think deeply about my leadership as a pastor and as a missionary, as an area director, leading ministries and international ministries in our own organization. When did I ever do that? And I've been thinking about that. So if I need to make a list and go back, I will do that to apologize. But did you have a moment that was like an aha, wow, that's me?
So, yes. And the moments came in a gentle enough way that I could receive them. And that's just the mercy of spirit, I think. Okay. But the first one was never spiritual, that I was a spiritual abuser. The first one came when I was in therapy, and the therapist was pointing out how my choices, my attitudes and my speech and my choices, behaviors were causing harm. And in particular, they were causing harm to the people that I really loved the most. you know, my precious 4 children and my wife at the time, I didn't wake up every morning thinking I'm going to be an abuser today and I'm going to harm them. I never connected those dots. And yet that was my reality, because when you listen to my wife at the time tell about what was going on in therapy, and I'm sure Grant does this for a living all the time, you realize that you're hearing people expose your reality. In other words, my wife was the mirror of my reality that I didn't want to admit yet. But it was in therapy and about harming her and harming my children that I began to slowly accept that I have the capacity to genuinely harm people. And I did not like that about myself, because I didn't really think that's what Jesus was about. You know, and I didn't like it. And I didn't know what to do about it. But I quit defending myself, saying it was her fault or it was whatever. And I began to slowly say, okay, I can admit that. I'm sorry. I was wrong there. Will you forgive me? And I remember distinctly incorporating the I'm sorry, I was wrong, will you forgive me phrases into my marriage. Way too late, I might add. But I did get them, and it started in therapy. That's the process that led me into being able to say, I'm sorry the way I pastored you. I'm sorry for having abused you. I was wrong. I want to make this right. Will you forgive me, etc.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. There's some very good comments also I want to draw your attention to in the chat box. So if you can't look at them now during this time, to go back to the video, and you can find it in event archives and go back and read the excellent comments that people are making as well. We want to look towards wrapping up our time together. If you have another question that you'd like to ask verbally or put into the chat box, please do so as we're going about this and beginning to land the plane, so to speak. I'd like to push this out to Grant, Dr. Grant Jones, Dr. Beth Davis, and Nathan Davis. Nathan is a retired psychologist. Beth is a counselor, and Grant is a practicing psychologist. And I think Nathan also will still practice and speaking with people. But any comments, any reflections from what we talked about the first two sessions, and what's come out from Alan and from Lee in this one that you believe are pertinent for all of us to know? You need
I'll
to
go.
unmute yourself.
I'll go first, I guess, and
Let
then
Grant go. He's fine.
then Nate. Yeah, it's overwhelming. I tried to tell anyway. I commend both Lee and Alan. It sucks, but the common denominator is you as the victim are made to be the problem. You are the problem. And then when you use spiritual authority, biblical authority, to coerce, to judge, to ostracize, to slander, is despicable. And both of you, your recovery process is just amazing. And we're going to talk about treatment next week. And there's some beautiful things that have already been shared as cornerstone components. But the part that just really frustrates the dickens out of me in the dozens of stories that I have collected, that theme is circle the wagons, defend the abuser, and demean the abusee. just over and over and over again. I just got a text yesterday from somebody who's from his organization, just is so frustrated because it's the same thing. They just tells a story, they circle the wagons, they protect the abuser, and then they discarded him, demeaned him. And it's just like that. How do we? That's what we got to change. That's what we got to change. And by exposing this, hopefully, the Lord will anoint all these efforts, and there will be changes that are coming. And we got some good help for helping those individually, but then organizationally and institutionally, that's really a more difficult process. And then the other common denominator: no accountability, absolutely no accountability, and or recourse or redress. Alan, you did everything by the book. If you're thinking you did anything wrong, I'm going to challenge you. Did not. And there's probably no one on this list that would say you did anything inappropriately. You did it right, correctly, prayerfully, and you threatened. That's the issue. I think most abusers in spiritual abuse are insecure individuals. I'm just going to say that. They do not, they're insecure, and it's hard for them to accept anything that would question their own self-perception. And then they couch it in, we're doing God's work. This is kingdom work. How dare you come against spiritually divine appointed, anointed kingdom work? And that's, so thank you both. Absolutely. Nathan and Beth.
Is my
Yeah,
microphone?
yeah, it's you.
Yeah, I just also want to say thank you for that beautiful presentation on both parts, for Lee and for Alan. And it really, in my heart, is moving me already to next week when we're going to talk about organizational change. And there's just this part of me that wants to say, if I could have the perfect organization, what would it look like? And how would the leadership be trained? How would everyone be trained in better practices? Also to find a safe place to share. I just felt that over and over in your presentations of where could you go with the heaviness in your heart? There wasn't a place created for you to go. And then there was an acceptance of questions. And I think that's a common thread in all the stories that I hear, is there is no place to take your questions. What if you're a person who has substance abuse in your life? Where do you go with that? It's against all of our rules to have something wrong with us. So I just applaud you for kind of getting this moving yet ahead to another step where maybe we can look at our bigger organizational structure and being better as we go ahead. Say something.
I'm looking forward to next week when we also talk about what do we do for the individuals? You know,
Yeah.
What do we do if we see ourselves as hurt? How do we go through healing steps? And there's a lot of good literature out there on that. We're going to talk about that next week also. So I'm looking forward to next week. There was, you were talking about the abuser is heavily defended as one common denominator. The other common denominator that I've seen again and again is that the minister's identity is destroyed in the process of the abuse. The abuse directly attacks who we are as a minister, and we're told that that we have failed, and we are the problem with that is that our very identity as a minister is rooted in integrity. And so when our integrity is attacked, it attacks who we are as a person, more than a secular person who says, I don't really care if you don't like my integrity and what you think. But we as a minister, our integrity is our identity. And so when our integrity, like Alan's integrity was attacked, that attacks the core self. And so we will be addressing that next week for sure.
I'd like to thank you all for sharing that. And just going back to something Lisa said over and over again, he went to a therapist, he went to a spiritual director. Let me just encourage you, Nathan, Beth, Grant are all trained counselors. Lee is a certified spiritual director. So am I, and we've all put our email addresses there. If you feel like you need someone to come alongside you in confidentiality, we'd be honored to do that. And I would encourage you not to hesitate. The longer you hesitate, the longer it takes healing to come, and also to preempt things happening that need not happen unless we had someone coming alongside us with wisdom and confidentiality. I'm going to conclude in prayer. And something else that he said that that when we have agency, it consists of voice and choice. But when we go through trauma, voice and choice are taken away. I thought that was profound, because we feel like no one hears us, and then we're stuck. We have no choices, no alternatives. And then he says that trauma removes these. People need therapy and spiritual directors to bring agency back into their lives, to bring voice and choice back into their lives. So if you're feeling voiceless, if you're feeling choiceless, if you know people that this would apply to, please refer them to the website. We'll be posting this in the next few days that they can watch it also. So we're there for those who aren't even on. But again, great job, Alan and Lee. Thank you so much. I'm going to dismiss in prayer, and then we'll close our time. And then I'd ask, if I know Lee has to go to his spiritual direction appointment, but if the rest could stay on that we're part of the panel, I certainly appreciate it. So let's pray. Father, we ask you to give us ears to hear what the Holy Spirit is saying to us. We would ask the Lord, Matthew 5, if there's something that's pricked our hearts where maybe we've practiced spiritual abuse in some way or another, and a face and a name has arisen, that we would do what needs to be done and going to that person and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, forgive me for this, because we do not want to be a spiritual abuser. Lord, I pray for those especially that have been abused, that are on this or who will watch this. I ask, Lord, that you will bring voice and choice back into their lives as you heal them of the trauma that they have experienced. I pray that the peace of God that surpasses all understanding would guard their hearts and their minds in Christ Jesus, that they would truly live in the charis of your grace and the complete shalom of your peace. We pray that you would infuse that by your spirit, by the truth of your word, and by the loving body of Christ that is there for us to be enfolded in and to function in as well. So we give this time to you, and we ask you to add your blessing to it. Let us see Jesus, him high and lifted up, and let us be drawn to him. Let us take every person that may have caused us harm and to simply pray, Jesus, I welcome you into their life. I release them to you. In Jesus' strong name, amen. Well, the Lord bless you all, and thank you for being on with us today. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Spread the word about the webinars that have been done and the one that's coming up. We certainly would like to see as many people as possible be ministered to. So the Lord bless you. We'll see you later.